it is the responsibility of my office to host the Lowell lecture. And it's a long-held history. The Lowell Institute, as some of you may know, began in 1836. There's only 2 people in this room who might remember that. And we'll just let you guess who that might be. One of the joys of the Lowell Institute is each year they invite us to make application for this lecture series. And each year, in collaboration with the dean and the faculty of this school, we spend some time to evaluate what it is people are talking about, what is coming up in community conversation, and where we need to go. Over this year, we decided to do something very different, and that is 3 different lectures over the period of the academic year. The first was held a week before the general election, and Dean Shapiro of the College of Arts and Sciences presented our first lecture. It was poorly attended because people were in the middle of midterms and thinking about many things and didn't want one more word about an election. But it was an astonishing evening, and that you can see on B Universe, because we record each of these evenings and they're ready for your consumption and conversion as needs be must. This lecture will be introduced by Dean Mary Elizabeth Moore, and our third lecture will be held on April the 9th, again in this location, and we are presenting 2 outstanding speakers, Chief Justice of the which nation? Chickasaw Nation. I've had so many C's I've called it Cherokee and others, so it's the Chickasaw Nation, as well as the Bishop of Wisconsin? Yes. And so, on that evening, we will be exploring not only civil discourse, but the notion of holy conferencing and holy conversation. All of these discussions on civil discourse this year have really been designed to help this community of the School of Theology and the greater Boston metropolitan area and New England to think through what does civil discourse mean and how do you enact it in real life. And rather than presenting a kind of academic approach to this, we've been really working to present to you a living approach. How do people in real decision-making places come to articulate the problem, and how do they work through it and solve it? We are delighted you are here. Again, I apologize that the repast promised before the lecture was not available, but some things are actually out of my control, which shocks me no end, actually. But more specifically, we will have food and refreshment for you immediately following this evening, so you will have something to look forward to past the brilliance that you're about to experience one-on-one. Let me then present for the introductions this evening our dean, our leader, our mentor, Mary Elizabeth Moore.
Thank you so much for being here. Your presence is as important as the presence of those who will be presenting. There is nothing in our society that is more important than civil discourse if we are to build a just and peaceful world. There is nothing in our society that is more easy to distort than civil discourse. Civil discourse can be an excuse for politeness that keeps some people quiet while others hold the floor. Civil discourse can be a fluffy addition to business as usual. We carry on business as usual and we call it something fancy like civil discourse or holy conversation, but it's really the same old, same old. We are trying this year to explore what civil discourse really means, if it is to take our hearts and change our ways and build a just and peaceful world. No panel could be more helpful in helping us explore this than the one we have tonight. I'm going to introduce the respondents first, using largely their words, and then I'll introduce our speaker. Our moderator for the evening is Bishop Susan Hassinger. And those of us who are here at the School of Theology know her well. She teaches courses on spirituality and leadership. Many things you may not know about her is that she has been a bishop for many years, and she served her term. She retired and was called out of retirement 2 different times because she's particularly agile at helping annual conferences and human beings work through knotty issues like combining annual conferences that have been separate, and so that her latest term was doing that. But she is a half-time lecturer with us here at the School of Theology. She was one of the co-founders, one of the dream team who envisioned the Just Peace movement within the United Methodist Church. She's well known as a consultant in this area. She is an outstanding teacher, spiritual mentor, and guru on all matters related to leadership and spirituality. Our first respondent will be Will Green, who's a student, an MDiv student here at the School of Theology and the pastor of the St. Nicholas United Methodist Church in Hull, Massachusetts. Will has served on the board of directors of the Reconciling Ministries Network, and he's actively engaged in working for the full inclusion of GLBTQ people in the United Methodist Church. Our other respondent is also very active as an elder in the Northern Illinois Conference of the United Methodist Church. Our own Pamela Lightsey, Associate Dean for Community Life and Lifelong Learning. Dean Lightsey, Dr. Lightsey, has served as a pastor in South Chicago. She has served as Dean of Student Affairs at Garrett Evangelical School of Theology, and we are very fortunate she's here with us. What may not be apparent to those of us who see her day in and day out here at the School of Theology is that she's also a very active leader within the denomination. She's very active in the Reconciling Ministries Network. She's on the executive committee for the Soul Repair Project, which studies the role of moral injury in veterans. And she has been an active leader, both formally and informally, toward the full inclusion of GLBTQ folks within the United Methodist Church, but within the larger society and within the larger ecumenical church. Those will be the people we hear from after we hear from our major speaker, who is Bishop Mel Talbert. Pause. We are standing on holy ground. Those of you who were in chapel yesterday, Wednesday, heard Bishop Talbert preach. Bishop Talbert is a man who speaks from the depths and centers of his heart. He is a man who has such integrity that when the United Methodist Church tries to censor him for the roles he's taken in most recent times, the Black Methodists for Church Renewal and other groups publicly proclaim that they will stand behind him, stand beside him. Bishop Talbot grew up in Louisiana. His first degree was in secondary education. When he experienced the call to ministry in college, he went to seminary, but he went to seminary to prove to himself and others that he was not called to ordained ministry. Lo and behold, he was. So he completed seminary, he was ordained, and he began serving churches. Also during this period, he became active in the Student Nonviolent SNCC. In 1960, he helped organize sit-ins in Atlanta, the very first sit-ins. Martin Luther King Jr. joined in those sit-ins, and they shared a jail cell for a few days. In 1980, after serving churches in the California Pacific Annual Conference, Melvin Talbert was elected bishop. He served in 2 different annual conferences, the Pacific Northwest and Northern California, Nevada. He also served in roles that I want you to be aware of, because he has been very active as a leader in ecumenical affairs as well as in the denomination. He served as secretary of the Council of Bishops. He served, that's in the United Methodist Church. He served as president of the National Council of Churches of Christ, USA. He attended every general conference of the United Methodist Church since 1968, and that itself is heroic. Before being elected bishop, in addition to serving local churches, he was the executive secretary for the General Board of Discipleship and led that board in major new directions. He also, in retirement, has served a 4-year term as the ecumenical officer for the Council of Bishops and as president of the Churches Uniting in Christ, the CUIC. He served as adjunct professor of United Methodist Polity and Practice at Vanderbilt University, where he still serves, by the way, and as executive director of the National Black Methodists for Church Renewal from 2004 to 2007. I would call that a very active retirement. I share this because I want you to be aware that this man is not only a leader within a denomination, he is an ecumenical leader, and he is a fearless prophet for racial, gender, and sexual and gender orientation, racial, gender, and sexual orientation inclusiveness. He believes, and this is a direct quote, there is room at God's table for everyone. Let us welcome our guest, Bishop Talbert, and let us be prepared to ground ourselves in this holy place at this holy moment.
Distinguished faculty, students, staff, guests, and friends of Boston University School of Theology, sisters and brothers, good evening.
Good evening.
I extend to you warm greetings in the name and in the spirit of Jesus Christ. I'm honored and I'm grateful to my longtime colleague and friend, Dr. Mary Elizabeth Moore, Dean, for her gracious invitation to Marilyn and me to visit this campus of this great seminary. And I'm more than honored to be asked to deliver one of the Lowell lectures. That is indeed an honor and privilege. This is my first visit to this historic campus. Many of my colleagues in ministry are and were graduates of this institution. This seminary has an illustrious history and has illumined the minds and illumined the minds of many visionary leaders in this nation and around the world. Of course, one of those illustrious leaders was the late Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. And then, as I preached on yesterday, I was reminded of the illustrious leadership of the late Dr. Howard Thurman, one that I had the privilege of meeting on several occasions, and what a privilege that was. Before getting into the major portion of my lecture, allow me to share a part of my story. Dr. Moore shared with you a part of that. I'm the son of sharecropper parents from the small country town of Clinton, Louisiana. I was born and raised in a racially segregated society. Every aspect of my early life was structured around the great racial divide, black and white. In my early childhood, I discerned from the teachings of my parents and my church that something was wrong with that picture. I knew within my soul that I could not survive in that environment. So I began looking for ways to escape. After completing high school, I entered Southern University at Baton Rouge, Louisiana. But due to an unexpected illness, I dropped out of college. And during that interim period, my maternal grandfather died, and his death precipitated a family dispute. His farm was sold in a sheriff's sale. And fortunately, the person who purchased the farm represented my mom and dad. So he sold the farm to us for the exact amount that he purchased it, and gave us 5 years to repay the loan. And he held the mortgage. So, for 4 years I worked in a variety of common labor jobs to help mom and dad pay for the farm. And when the final payment was made 4 years later, I began reflecting on the future direction of my life. My older brother came to visit from Chicago, and he invited me to go back to Chicago with him to work in the steel mill, and I agreed. I packed my bag and was off to Chicago. But we went to my little church prior to leaving. And fortunately, my pastor, who was a young, energetic, upstart pastor, asked me where was I going, and I told him. He said, well, don't you leave until you talk to me after the service. When the service was over, he just came walking in. He said, where's your brother's car? And took him to the car. Where's your bag? He said, it's in the trunk. Open the trunk. He literally took the trunk out of the back of my brother's car and placed it in his car. And he said, you're going to Southern University with me today. Chicago will be there after you finish Southern University. Now, during my final semester at college, I discovered that preparation for being a secondary education teacher at Clinton was not something I wanted to do. So I had a long struggle of the soul. Following conversations with several key persons in my life, I was confronted with the call to the ordained ministry. They helped me to recognize what was going on. And finally, one night in my bed, in my room, there were 6 of us in the room, but this particular night, I was there alone. I allowed myself to consider the ordained ministry. And it was as though I was standing before a dark tunnel, and a light pierced the darkness and soared into infinity. And my response was, all right, God. All right, God. I'm going to give it a try. And so I agreed and went to seminary. And I entered seminary in the spring semester of 1959. And of course, I had no intention of staying in seminary because I didn't want to be a preacher. That was the last thing that I wanted to do with my life. But engagement with professors and students in seminary hooked me. And so in the fall of 1960, I became involved in the sit-in demonstrations in Atlanta, the sit-in movements. I made the commitment to nonviolence. We invited Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to join us in the sit-in demonstrations, and he was arrested with us, and I was privileged to spend 3 days and 3 nights in the same jail cell with him. And that experience changed and shaped my life and directions forever. I consider myself to be a disciple of Dr. King's nonviolent movement, which changed the direction of this country. and the King Gandhi philosophy of nonviolence shaped my entire ministry beyond seminary, and it continues to shape my witness and ministry in retirement. Now, the intersection of oppression and privilege. In this lecture, which is not intended to be a scholarly treatise, I can only scratch the surface of the issues and concerns underlying the topic that I shall discuss. The intersection of oppression and privilege is a reality for all of us. The question is, how do we embrace that reality in a way that fosters the beloved community envisioned by Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.? After prayerful reflection, I came to the conclusion that it would be most beneficial for me to approach this subject out of my own experience as a person of color, a person who has known oppression. My oppression had to do with race. An African American born and lived through a time when Jim Crow law was my reality and my church sanctioned my oppression. I learned early in life that race prejudice is a reality for all races, not just white folk. In my early life, I hated white people who did such terrible things to us. Each of us is guilty of race prejudice and race bias. In the book Set Free, A Journey Towards Solidarity Against Racism by Iris de Leon Hartshorn, Tobin Miller Scherer, and Regina Shands Schultzfuss, I found this statement that sums up my experiences of oppression, and I quote, "Racism is not the same as racial prejudice. Where racial prejudice is held by many of us regardless of our skin color, racism is only present when a given group in society has the power to enforce their prejudices so that they receive more benefits and privileges than other groups." So racism equals prejudice. Racism equals race prejudice plus the misuse of systemic power. In our early days, in the sit-in demonstration days in the South, we understood racism to be prejudice plus power. So we had to learn how to deal with prejudice plus power at the point that it intersected with our oppression. Now these authors conclude that racism is like an iceberg afloat in the sea of life in our society. Racism is not as one-dimensional as the definition suggests. It can be found in three primary manifestations: individual, institutional, and systemic. Likewise, each of these manifestations has three levels: oppressive power, white power, and identity power. Let's take a quick look at this racism iceberg. Oppressive power of racism is what we see and what we experience. It's the visible acts that are part of the larger system which says that people of color are not human. So it's all right to hurt them and to deny them basic human rights of equal access to benefits and privileges. And some examples of oppressive power of racism are separate but equal public accommodations, churches and schools, I can still see in my mind those white only, colored only signs. I can still feel the sting of oppression that was so evident in those early years. Other manifestations were denying equal opportunity for employment for people of color in every aspect of society. But the other level is white power. You don't see it. It's underneath the surface. But that's the core of racism. It is where racism's purpose resides, because racism is not really about hurting people of color. It is about giving privilege and power to white people. Within the system of racism, white people are superior. Things that happen at the tip of the iceberg, the oppressive power, happen because of the core. Some examples of this level of power are the enactment of laws to make legal the right of white people to discriminate based on race. So the white only, the colored only signs were legal and were vigorously enforced by law enforcement personnel. To violate such laws could result in being arrested and jailed with severe and extreme penalties, whether you were colored, quote, or white. But the most damaging level of racism is at the base of the iceberg. Here, racism claims the power to tell people of color and white people who they are. As we all know, God has already solved this problem. We are all part of the family of God, no exceptions. Yet, racism attempts to usurp the authority of God. It is at the identity level that racism begins to shape us and tells us what to think and what to feel about others.